What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. Adam here with Cape Crawlers, and today we're going to talk about shock setup on the SCX24s, specifically these long travel double barrel shocks. So the long travel shocks are a great upgrade you can do to these SCX24s. They really open up a lot of possibilities as far as tire size goes, because they're going to give you that extra clearance to fit a much bigger tire in there. They lengthen your suspension travel significantly over stock, which is going to give you a lot more articulation and suspension to go over larger obstacles. But right out of the box, they can be pretty tricky to set up. There's often binding issues. They don't operate super smooth. The springs are really stiff. It jacks up your ride height and skews your center of gravity. So it can be pretty awkward and frustrating at first when you get these shocks. So in this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips on how to set these up for smooth operation, nice articulation, and customizable ride height. Plus, I'm going to give you 1 tip at the end to also improve your performance and make these things a little more manageable once you've got them installed on your rig. So let's check it out. So let's talk about customization and ride height that fits your needs and your build. So as you can see, what we've got here is 2 very different rigs, both running similar suspension. Both of these rigs are running the 43mm double barrel suspension setups. We've got Endura on the Gladiator and we've got RC Lions here on the JLU. But you can see from a ride height perspective, the Gladiator is sitting much taller. And the reason for that is there's a couple different things. Primarily, it's because the JLU is running with no springs on the shocks. And the purpose of that is to keep the center of gravity low. Keep this thing sagged real low so that you've got maximum stability and you've got maximum performance for going over rocks and going over challenging obstacles. For the Gladiator here, it's got the softest springs that come with the Endura shocks. Even the softest springs, as you can see, are still pretty stiff. They're stiffer than stock for sure, and they're going to lift that body up significantly. And this is my son's rig, and he likes it to set up this way because all he cares about is he just wants the clearance to run big tires and for it to look cool. And a lot of people are of the same opinion, and that's totally cool. It's your build. If you want it to look jacked up and put big tires on it and have it sit super high like that, totally cool. That's all you. That's the beauty of these things, is that you can customize them to what you want. A lot of people like to focus on performance specifically and try to lower these things as much as possible and make these things into the belly dragger that we see here. It's totally up to you. But the purpose of this video is to show you how to make these things work nice and smooth. So most of these tips will be universal. I am assuming though, since you follow me, and if you followed me from Instagram, you're probably interested on how to get that sweet articulation and how to get all that flex out of these double barrel shocks. Because let's face it, one of the coolest things about the double barrel shocks, the long travel shocks, is that you get immense articulation gains, and that's just fun. So we're going to focus a lot on the articulation and getting the most articulation out of these shock setups. But the tips I'm going to give you are going to be universal and will work to improve your shocks no matter what your build setup is. So let's dive into this and take a closer look at some of the tips I got for you. Alright, tip number 1. If you're experiencing binding issues, run your shocks upside down. I know that sounds weird, but believe me when I say that it can make a big difference in smooth operation of your shocks. So here I've got the C10, and let's take a closer look. I'll show you the setup that I'm running on this. So here's my little C10. So the C10 has the same Endura double barrel shocks that I'm running on my son's Gladiator that you saw earlier. When I got these, I experienced some significant binding issues with these. And I tried putting grease on the shock shafts. I tried sanding them down, very lightly. I didn't do a whole lot. But I tried to rough them up. In any case, I just still couldn't solve the binding issues until I saw on, I think it was a Facebook group, someone said to run them upside down. So I did, And I found that it works really, really well. And the logic is that when the body is upside down, the barrels actually collapse down into themselves with less resistance than in a traditional fashion where they have to push up inside that direction. So you've got gravity working with you to just kind of help these things just collapse within inside themselves and kind of fall down on themselves rather than being pushed up inside the shaft from down to up. And it works. It makes for a smoother action. It smoothed these things out right away and made a big difference. So that's one of the things that I would really strongly suggest if you are experiencing binding issues, no matter what you're running for a mounting position or for a spring setup. That would be one of the first things I would suggest you try, is to flip them around and see how that works for you. Tip number 2, this is going to have to do with how you mount your shocks. So a trick to get a little more articulation, but also to help eliminate binding and make for smoother action, is eliminating one O-ring on the top mounting point of your shocks. So let's take a closer look here. I'll show you what I mean. So here's the JL here. So if you look at the suspension on this, again, double barrel shocks here. These are the RC Lion brand. These shocks, they all are pretty much the same, but on this upper mount here, if you just do one O-ring, make sure you've got the wide flange on the outside mounting point, and that's where you're going to have no O-ring. So you want the smaller flange on the inside with the O-ring, so that it's bolted around here. It's bolted in so that you don't lose your O-ring. So wide flange on the outside and run no O-ring there. And you can see that it's got a decent amount of play. But what that does is when you flex and fully articulate, it just gives that shock a little more room to pivot on that ball. And if you're having binding issues, it could be that your axle's trying to articulate, but your shock is too tight and can't move with the axle as much as it should. So you get a little more flex because that shock is actually going to bend in under the frame. You see, it's just got a little bit, couple more degrees of articulation there because that shock can move with the axle a little more under the frame. And if you're having binding issues, this can potentially help solve them because that shock's got room to move on the ball up here, and it's not getting pulled against the mounting position to the same extreme degree that it would with the two O-rings here. So the shock mounting point here can pivot a little more, keep the shock body straight while your axle's fully extended, and just gives you a little more smoother action, particularly at these extreme angles when you get towards full articulation. So that's a good one, not only to give you extra articulation, but to give you some smoother action while your axles are moving around going over obstacles. And if you do that, at all four corners. So I showed you the front, but you also want to do that in the back too. So if you do that on all four corners, those combined add up to a significant amount of articulation gain and just smoother action all around. So give that a shot if you're having binding issues or if you just want a little more extra flex. Tip number 3, let's talk about spring selection and mounting position. So this is kind of 2 tips in one, but they work together, and I'll show you why. This is all about customizing your ride height and your performance to suit your needs and your build, what you're looking to accomplish. So here we have 3 rigs with different suspension setups on them here. So let's take a look at what we got. First off, let's look at the Gladiator. Again, the Gladiator is running the 43mm shocks mounted to the stock towers in the stock position, running the softest springs that come with the shocks. So usually when you get these shocks, you'll get 3 sets of springs that come with them. Black is usually the softest. If they do not come with the black ones installed, I highly suggest you at least start your adjustments using the softest spring, because I have found that the varying degrees, the medium and the stiff, are so stiff. I don't know what you would ever use those springs for on a 124 scale build. They are absurdly stiff. So maybe if you had a very built scale overland rig, you could benefit from these stiffer springs. But for the most part, these soft ones are a good starting point to kind of build on from there. So that's what we're running on the Gladiator here. And again, as you can see, it's got plenty of ride height to clear these big tires. It's got lots of articulation, but it sits really high. So depending on what you want, let's say you want huge articulation, but you also are running into issues with side hilling and to some degree in your vertical climbing ability. So what you can do is mess with your shock positioning. So let's take a look at another build here. Let's use the C10 for an example. So the C10 is running an interesting combination here. On the back, I've got the 43mm Enduro shocks, same as the Gladiator, running them upside down, but what I've done is I've put stock springs on here. So what that does is it gives you all the benefits of the long travel suspension, but you retain the stock ride height because it's going to sit on those stock springs. So that's a great kind of middle ground. So to do that, you take apart your stock springs. You do that, you unscrew the cap. Let's see if I got one. I got one right here. So these come apart and you can twist off the cap here and then use your hex driver on the inside, unscrew that, and you can pop the springs out. And then you can put the springs on the new double barrels. And that's a great way to get factory ride height, but still capitalize on all that articulation, because when you go over bumps or when the wheels drop, the spring doesn't matter. So you're going to get all that travel when the wheels drop. But when you come back down or you go back up, you've got the same resistance from the stock shocks. So it gives you that factory looking ride height, but you get all the benefits of the long travel shocks. So that's a really popular way to run the double barrels, and it works really, really well. Taking this one step further, let's look at the JLU. Again, we saw this earlier, that this has no springs whatsoever. So this is going to sit rock bottom, just right on the bottomed out shocks. So taking the springs out sets it as low as you can go, but once again, you still get all that articulation. So this thing is a great example. Going over bumps and uneven terrain, the wheels just drop around and over obstacles, and it stays flat as a pancake pretty much for the most part with the body. So it keeps it nice and low, but the wheels are just dropping and articulating and doing their thing because there's no resistance and it's got all that travel from the long travel shocks. So this is probably my favorite approach to running these shocks. And I even like to take it a step further, mount them to the frame so you get even more room for articulation. See, if the stock towers are up here, drop your shock mounting down here to the frame, you've got a significant gain in travel there before you max out your shocks. So this is like my preferred method of using these shocks. So those are my 3 tips for smooth operating, efficiently running long travel shocks on these 124s. Yeah, those tips should help you customize your ride height and get your build situated the way you want and really maximize these shocks, because they're a super fun upgrade, but they can definitely be frustrating. So that should help you at least get started on the right foot, and then you can customize it from there. But I'm going to give you one more tip here before I go, because I'm certain you're going to run into this if you put the double barrel shocks on there, and that is the need for limiting straps on the front of your rig. So these are 2 prime examples of rigs that desperately needed limiting straps. So I'm going to show you what I did and the idea behind limiting straps so that you can either make your own or pursue another direction, but at least you'll understand why we need limiting straps and the benefit to them. So let's take a closer look. Limiting straps. So they do exactly what the name implies. They limit the travel of your suspension. That may sound counterintuitive, but I'll tell you why this is important. Because when you run these double barrel shocks, one of the things that they are notorious for, and it's a huge pain in the butt when you are climbing in particular, when you're going up a hill, they unload on you and they give you that monster truck effect. So if you're going up a hill, you'll see the front end of your vehicle does a Hail Mary and just points straight to the sky. And this is almost always going to flip you over backwards, and it can be super frustrating. So definitely one of the biggest drawbacks of these double barrel shocks and the long travel shocks in general. So a way to combat this is to use limiting straps. So all this limiting straps are going to do is they're just going to stop your axle from dropping all the way to full articulation there. And it doesn't take much. You only have to limit it by quarter or half an inch. But what that does is that it just keeps your axle snug up against the body and stops you from going just that extra degree there to flip over. So what I've done, I like to use rubber bands. So this is the Gladiator here. And how I do this, on the Gladiator in particular here, I've got 2 rubber bands. The Gladiator is 4-linked. So it's got, instead of a Y-link, 1 mounting position behind the drive shaft here, it has 2 individual links. So that's why I'm running 2 individual rubber bands under each link there in the front. I'll show you on the JL how I've got that one set up with 1 rubber band. But the Gladiator is very heavy, so I've doubled up the rubber bands here. So I loop them around the linkage right behind the servo mount, and then up over the body towers. And that to me is just enough to stop the articulation at a point that I don't flip over all the time. But the beauty of this, and why it's important, I feel, to mount these in the center here, like I like right behind the servo, because you still get full range of articulation side to side. You have your limit straps in the middle so your axle can pivot. It doesn't limit your actual articulation. It only limits when that axle drops completely. Let's look at the JL. So here's another example looking at the JL with 1 rubber band. So again, JL is 4-linked. This was the same setup I was running on the stock link with the Y-link. It just runs 1 rubber band under the drive shaft, or over, depending on how you look at it, between the drive shaft and the servo mount and that linkage attachment. And again, just goes up over the body. In this case, I've just looped it around the body post. So the C10, remember the C10, I'm running the stock shocks in the front, and that's basically a workaround for limit straps. So if I pick this up and look at it, you can see how much further the back end drops than the front end. So this is going to make me much more stable on up hills, because the front end can only lift that much, versus if it had the double barrels, it would drop significantly more. So that's why I put the stock shocks on here with the flex blades. So it gives me more travel than stock, but not as much as the double barrels would, so I don't flip over all the time on verticals. I did put limit straps on here because I go back and forth with the double barrels. So this is an example of what I did on the C10. C10 is running the Y-link stock linkage system. See if you can see that. It's looped between the Y-link and the drive shaft and goes up over the mounting posts. And I like the rubber bands because you can loop it around multiple times and customize your ride height. So the shocks are stopping this before the limit strap can really kick in and do its thing. But when I put the double barrels on here, this is a lifesaver because it does a great job keeping that axle tucked in on vertical climbs. But again, allowing that articulation side to side because it's mounted in the center. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope this helped you out. I know that these shocks can be frustrating right out of the box, so I hope that gave you some good tips to make them work a little smoother and customize your build and get it to the way you want. As always, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. I thank you for your time. Let me know down in the comments below if you've got any other questions. Happy to dive into this more, or if you want to take a look at one of these builds and the suspension setups that I've got going on in here. There's a lot of different variety. Happy to do a separate video or just chat about it in the comments down below. As always, I appreciate you. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.